My name is Andy Fleming, and this presentation is intended as a supplement to the presentation I made at the Let Justice Roll virtual conference last week. First, I just want to say thank you to the conference organizers. They worked very hard, and it came off really well. It was so encouraging just to hear biblical teaching and to also get to know people who have faced issues of social justice all around the world. Thank you for the open sharing. Thank you for the insight. I believe we all were richly blessed by the experience. The topic that I was assigned is the myth of a Christian nation. And I just want to look more closely and finish really the overview that I'd begun. At the conference, I was able to look at this idea of the New Testament perspective and then also the Constantinian shift, which really is describing a phenomena that took place in the 4th century. But I really didn't have time to present my thoughts about the American proposition and what we can gain and understand from the historical overview. The myth of a Christian nation. First, the New Testament perspective in review. These are the words of the apostles after Jesus had risen from the dead and the day of Pentecost had not yet happened. And so we read here, when they, the apostles, met together, they asked him, "Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel?" He said to them, "It's not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." Clearly from their question, even the disciples did not understand what the church was going to look like. Standard Jewish expectations were both political and earthly. They wanted their own territory, their own government, and independence from other nations. But with the coming of the Holy Spirit came an understanding that the church was not to be like this. In contrast to something earthly, the New Testament writers used terms like strangers and aliens in this world. And then through rebirth as a Christian, citizenship in heaven was established. Whatever was earthly was temporary and soon to pass. In drawing analogies from Jewish history, the favored historical context was the wilderness wandering. The Israelites had been freed from bondage in Egypt, wandered the desert for 40 years, and then eventually entered the promised land. On both sides of this story is a passing through a body of water. And in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul compares the passing through the Red Sea with baptism. This was the beginning of a time of wandering with God. It's a time of testing. And God manifested himself in the tabernacle, and he supplied the needs of the people with manna from heaven. And in this we can see the Christian story. First, we're freed from our sin, and then we have an adult lifetime of walking with God. His presence is with us. We're dependent on him. And then eventually physical death will be the last river we cross and the transition to a new life in heaven, truly the promised land. The mandate to make disciples of all nations was not a political mandate. It was a spiritual mandate that could be accomplished regardless of people, tribe, language, or nation. But unfortunately, by the 3rd century, we can already see forces at work to make the church more acceptable to society and society more acceptable to the church. Both Tertullian and Cyprian agonized over the spiritual condition of the church. From their perspective, the church was more and more accommodating the culture around them and losing its potency of witnessing Christ to the world. By Cyprian's time, there was a growing group of clergy who supported the idea of less strenuous expectations for members of the church, and eventually these forces would win out. This conflict was called, or was described as, rigor versus laxity in church discipline. Cyprian's high view of God working in the life of the church led him to pronounce that the governmental persecutions were actually sent by God to purify the church. This brings us into the 4th century and to a phenomena that theologians have called the Constantinian shift. In the beginning of the 4th century, we have a number of significant milestones. First, in 301 CE, Armenia became the first country to make Christianity their official religion, and 16 years later, Georgia followed suit. In 311, the last great persecution of the Roman Empire ended with the Edict of Toleration, and in 313, the emperors Constantine and Licinius declared Christianity legal and affirmed religious freedom. In 325, the Emperor Constantine called the First Council of Nicaea as an effort to attain consensus in the church, and it was here that the Nicene Creed was formulated. In 391, the Emperor Theodosius ordered the cessation of sacrifices and the closing of pagan temples. The Roman Empire was now officially Christian, and religious freedom greatly diminished, if not even extinguished. The Constantinian shift meant that being a citizen of a country or participant in a culture would now, in many instances, include church membership. The idea of a Christian nation had now become a norm, but the price was high. The meaning of the word Christian had now become more culturally based, and the individual right to become a Christian became synonymous with the right of citizenship and nationality. History from this point forward says it all, especially in the area of social justice and the use of power. Creeds and liturgies became equal to Scripture. Nonconformance resulted in anathema or curses and excommunication from the church. The church would constantly become entwined in politics and materialism. Peasants would beg for charity standing at the gates of palatial church buildings covered with gold. The Great East-West Schism of 1054, rooted in the cultural differences between Greek and Roman cultures, and linguistic barrier of Greek and Latin languages. From the late 11th century to the late 13th century, at least 9 different crusades were launched. The failed Fourth Crusade ended with the sacking of Constantinople, the center of Eastern Christianity, and this weakened the Byzantine Empire so much that it eventually fell to Muslim power in the 15th century. In the 12th century, the Holy Inquisition began, which was intended to root out heresy through the use of violence, torture, and even death. In some places, the Inquisition was practiced until the mid-19th century. For the most part, there was a great divide between the clergy and the laity, and almost all Christian activity was relegated to the official programs of the church. Evangelism became part of a political agenda, often including conquest and subjugation of native peoples. The Christian nations of Europe were at war with each other, in many cases both sides seeking the affirmation of the Catholic Church. All of this was part and parcel of what it meant to be a Christian nation for much of the last millennia. Now the church had wealth, power, and political influence. One other observation should be made. Despite all of this corruption, there were still those seeking deeper meaning in the Christian faith and doing their best to live according to the teachings of Jesus. But we can see the Constantinian shift had a great influence on how the church presented itself to the world. Now that the church had power, there was a possibility of abuse. And now that the church had influence culturally, that was reciprocal, and culture also influenced the church. One other observation should be made. Despite all this corruption, there are still those seeking deeper meaning in Christian faith and doing their best to live according to the teachings of Jesus. At the end of the 15th century, the Catholic Church in Western and Central Europe began to experience a Reformation. Despite all the amazing biblical exploration and discovery accompanying the Reformation, almost all the key reformers were Constantinian in their ecclesiology. It may be this reason alone that infant baptism was not changed in many Reformation churches, since infant baptism complements the idea of a national cultural church. In late 1524, Zwingli, one of the chief reformers in Geneva, began to distance himself from the Anabaptists because he was not willing to give up infant baptism. This was firmly rooted in his desire to maintain a Constantinian-like relationship between church and state. And he was not willing to preach believers' baptism, the view that the church was a community of regenerative believers. This idea of national Christianity was taking the spiritual center out of the Christian message. Elaine Heath makes this observation in The Mystic Way of Evangelism. Sadly, the whole Constantinian shift, the church has become more like the world than the world becoming like the church. In many places, Christianity has solidified, even petrified, into a new type of social order that differs very little from the world around it. Constantinianism is the church forgetting that it's on a journey It's no longer in a wilderness wandering. Instead, it's making itself at home in the world. This now brings us to the American proposition. Although intended as a unifying and fortifying tenet, the assertion that the United States of America was founded as a Christian nation has proven to have many detrimental effects, not the least of which being its inability to constructively inform the current relationship between church, state, and society. As the theme of this conference suggests, freedom and justice are important conversations in our modern context. And in America, this discussion has been made more complex by the myth that America was founded as a Christian nation. If this is true, then American society must be considered a Christian society, or at least a society being guided by Christian principles. But then when we examine how justice has been meted out, the misuse of power, or the lack of protection for the vulnerable, how do we understand this if this is indeed a Christian society? For some, this reflects badly on Christianity. For others, it encourages them to push for more Christian control and power in politics. Unfortunately, both positions are based on wrong assumptions. By sociological and demographical definitions, the United States may appear to be founded as a free Christian nation. But in reality, the history and context of the founding of the United States is better described as the founding of a nation free to be Christian. To better examine this, I'd like us to first review the religious and philosophical environment surrounding the nation's founding, and secondly, examine the evidence within the founding documents themselves. Let's look at history. Let's look at the documents. Let's take a look at the colonial period. For the most part, all the colonizing powers in America, Spain, France, and England, had imperialism and commerce as their primary concern. But whereas the French and Spanish were monolithically Catholic, the English colonies were very pluralistic in their Christian practice. This pluralism is important because it helps explain some of the phenomena in the founding of the United States. Just in review, the New England colonies were Puritan. The middle colonies were mixed with Quakers, Catholics, Lutherans, Jewish, and others. Some of these colonies were also looking for religious freedom, and Pennsylvania was founded by the Quakers and granted freedom to all who believed in one God. Maryland was initially established as a Catholic stronghold, and this was due to the fact that at its institution, Catholicism had momentarily had an upsurgence and taken control of the English situation. The southern colonies were predominantly Anglican and Baptist. Although immigrants were coming from all over Europe, these were all British colonies from the start, except New York, which was originally Dutch and then taken over by the British within a few decades. The common mythology of America is often skewed and looks to the Puritan story as the shared experience. These two pictures demonstrate the idealism of the Puritans. The logo of the Massachusetts Bay Company with a Native American mimicking the Macedonian call. He's calling out, "Come, help us." Or the powerful rhetoric describing a city set on a hill. The Puritans possessed an unabashed idealism and conviction that by means of a new start in America, they could create a Christian society on earth. Sadly, the Puritan experiment was just another version of Constantinianism. And paradoxically, although the Puritans were seeking religious freedom, they were intolerant of any other form of Christianity. Their vision of a Christianized society mixed the functions of church and government. Rhode Island, one of the original New England colonies, was begun in protest to the Puritan way as practiced in Massachusetts. So as a result, the oppressed, in seeking their own freedom, actually became the oppressors. Historically, the Puritan experiment had massively failed by the time of the American Revolution. Their ministry efforts to the indigenous peoples were mostly ineffective. By the third generation, many Puritans became disillusioned with the Puritan practice and ideals. As previously noted, due to immigration, the colonies contained many different ethnicities and Christian faiths. Therefore, diversity and pluralism were part of the colonial landscape from the very beginning. On a positive note, the fact that there was so much territory and room for expansion helped maintain the peace within this diversity. So, what did Christianity look like at the time of the American Revolution? Stark and Fink published an interesting study back in 1908 and found that most historians agreed that the original colonies did not exude universal piety. No more than 10 to 20% of the population actually belonged to a church congregation. Stark and Fink would examine the evidence of church attendance and church meetings and actually do, through statistical study, make some other conclusions. But one commonly held assumption that Stark and Fink's research contradicted was that New England colonies had significantly better church membership when compared with the middle colonies or the southern colonies. At first glance, this seems true. New England had 12% membership rate, middle colonies 11%, southern colonies 7%. But when one adjusts these numbers accounting for the African American slave population, which up until this point had not been significantly Christianized, the membership rate for white Americans was approximately 12% in all three regions. Blacks made up 42% of the population of the southern colonies. At the same time, there were dramatic differences in how the denominations were spread throughout the colonies. In New England, almost 99% of all the Congregationalists were there. In the middle colonies, more than 85% of all the German Reformed, Lutheran, and Dutch Reformed, more than 60% of the Quakers, and 54% of the Presbyterians. And in the southern colonies, almost 50% of all Baptists and Episcopalians. So we see that the colonies differed in their denominational makeup. Therefore, in 1776, about 12% of the American population were church members, with 98.1% being Protestant, 1.7% being Roman Catholic, and 0.2% being Jewish. This is not to say that only 12% believed in some form of Christian faith. With very few expectations, all of these immigrants were coming from countries with long histories of Christian belief, culture, and tradition. And as noted by John Fee, the founding fathers lived in a world in which Christianity was the only game in town. And the powerful influence of Christianity, especially Protestant Christianity, held unrivaled influence. Inherent systemic oppression during the colonial period. Clearly, the treatment of racial minorities, especially African slaves and Native Americans, was not Christian in the colonial period. The nationalistic and cultural arrogance that naturally accompanied Constantinian thinking now showed itself in racism. At the same time, it must be remembered that this arrogance was shared by most of the European countries from which the colonists had come. As a result, the majority of Protestant mission work in the pre-revolutionary time was relatively ineffective. Most mission efforts operated on the assumption that European enculturation must happen first and was labeled as civilizing the native population. Because of the imperialistic and commercial priorities, British contact with Indians often did more harm than good in the sharing of the Christian faith. Also, the fact that Western European Christianity had successfully racialized the father and son into white-skinned Western European types only served further to distort the Christian message. How terrible that biblical images like Israel taking the promised land was now being used to justify both conquest and subjugation of native peoples. As we can see from the map, North America was already populated before the coming of the Europeans, and the various Native American tribes had well-established territories, although the boundaries were somewhat fluid and there were ongoing conflicts. Considering the wealth of the continent in natural resources, the fur trade and commerce could have been mutually beneficial. But colonization began to push the tribes in upon each other, and obviously there was resistance. One notable exception to this missionary ineffectiveness was the Moravians under David Zeisberger. They became the most effective Protestant missionaries, and part of this may have been due to their own low socioeconomic standing. First beginning with the Iroquois and then the Delawares, Zeisberger helped the converts create peaceful villages. Unfortunately, these settlements were constantly required to relocate as the wilderness they occupied became coveted by European settlers. After a number of westward moves and a terrible massacre at the hands of a revolutionary militia, Zeisberger eventually went north to upper New York State and then on to Canada, where the Moravian Native American churches actually survived for generations. Another notable exception were there certain individuals who spoke out against slavery a century before the Civil War. One particular noteworthy tract was that of Samuel Sewall, a Puritan judge of the Superior Court of Massachusetts Colony. He wrote a tract called The Selling of Joseph, a Memorial. And in this he argued that all men are sons of Adam, and the earth was given to all. Also, a noteworthy proponent of anti-slavery was Benjamin Lay. And in 1738, he condemned slavery and was ejected from the Philadelphia yearly meeting of the Quakers. But in 1774, the same meeting forbade all Quakers from holding slaves on pain of disfellowshipment. Lay's book that he published against slavery was 278 pages long. One final aspect that needs to be discussed in the religious and philosophical environment is the rise of deism. Deism, like the Protestant Reformation, also had its roots in the Renaissance humanism that affected European thinking and culture, and consequently surfaced in the late 17th century. Although there were some deists that rejected all organized religion for fostering divisive sectarianism, for encouraging persecution, and for stifling freedom of thought and speech throughout history, there are also many deists who respected the moral teachings of Jesus without believing in his divinity. And beyond this, there were even those who viewed themselves as Christians, went to church, prayed, and assigned a salvatory role to Jesus, some of these individuals even being active clergy. David Holmes says that deists repeatedly called into question any teaching or belief of Christianity that they could not reconcile with human reason. For them, reason was paramount in determining religious truth. Deism was on the rise in the second half of the 18th century and eventually unseated orthodoxy at Yale, Harvard, and other denominational colleges. The publishing of Paine's The Age of Reason in 1795 probably marked the final chapter in the popularity of deism, because he overzealously attacked and mocked Judeo-Christian beliefs, denying any form of divine revelation beyond the creation. Paine's book activated Christians in America, and actually in response to his book started a whole nother wave of evangelistic preaching. Two aspects of deism that seem especially significant regarding the founding fathers: deism emphasized ethical endeavors, hence the concern of most deists for social justice and their profound opposition to all forms of tyranny. And in the place of the Hebrew God, deists postulated a distant deity to whom they referred to with terms such as the first cause, the creator of the universe, the God of nature, nature's God, and divine providence. Ultimately, deism lacked mystery, emotional appeal, and a model of true worship and a basis for a faith community. Together with the destructive consequences of the French Revolution and Napoleon's reign, the appeal of such Enlightenment-based rationalism was greatly diminished for the general American population. Let us now turn our attention to the founding documents. There is a great difference between coming to America to gain freedom to do what you want to do religiously, as opposed to coming to America to establish a place where religious freedom was fostered. It's interesting to note in those exceptions to systemic oppression, we actually see small Reformation groups that were not Constantinian. They really didn't want to be involved governmentally, and were trying to create and understood the church to be something separate from the world at large. Let's turn our attention now to the founding documents of the United States. When we examine the words of the Declaration of Independence, we must acknowledge that they are neither specifically Christian, nor are they exclusively secular. In making a public declaration of their rights as human beings to be free to be governed properly, the writers and signers of the Declaration affirm the existence of a higher law and of a higher power. The separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind, requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Far from a secular, non-religious statement, the writers of the Declaration appeal to the laws of nature and of nature's God, and to the Creator who created all men equal with certain unalienable rights. And then, after listing their many grievances and accusations against the King of Great Britain, the writers and signers again appeal to a higher power. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Again, in nothing other than existential language, the commitment is made to do what is right, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for affirmation, and then entrusting themselves to divine providence. While the argument of the Declaration is far from secular, with its consistent appeal to a higher person and power, there is nothing particularly Christian about the grounds for which this appeal is argued and affirmed. In fact, the writers and signers appear to agree that such principles are self-evident and not in need of external validation. Although many of the founding fathers were sincerely religious persons, the most influential among them seem to be drawn to more non-traditional forms of Christianity, a tendency possibly connected to the formative experience of their college educations and private study. Benjamin Franklin saw Jesus more as a model of good living than as the incarnate Son of God. George Washington was a conventional Anglican and apparently did not take communion nor attend church regularly. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison had respect for faith but distrusted traditional Christianity and did not believe in the miracles of Jesus. John Adams believed that religion was essential for the cultivation of a virtuous citizenry and was a prerequisite for the success of the Republic. For many, the fundamental tenets of deism seemed to resonate, and from the language of the Declaration it would appear that they all found enough commonality in that formulation that they would agree to its meaning and usage of its terms. Although Holmes concluded that because of this usage, deism inevitably undermined the personal religion of Judeo-Christian tradition, it seems to me that this choice to use the more generic terms that deism provided helped to make their usage less vulnerable to denominational interpretation and thereby less provocative and contentious. For the intents and purposes of the Declaration, the Creator's function was limited to being the ultimate source, provider, and upholder of human rights, and not much more. No greater purpose for humanity's creation was enumerated. On further reflection, one reason for this apparent lack of reference is actually found within the Declaration itself when it proposed to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. The underlying argument within the Declaration was that all men have been given inalienable rights from the Creator, and among those rights is the power to institute government. With this philosophical groundwork laid, the founders could now get on with the work of exercising those rights and instituting their own government. In other words, God had played his role, and now it was time for the founding fathers to responsibly play theirs. Now let's take a look at some other documents. Both the Constitution of the United States in 1789 and the Bill of Rights 1791, which is the name given to the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, make no mention of a divine person, divine power, or divine law. Instead, they recognized the reality of religion and painstakingly clarified its relation to government. On closer examination, the Constitution declares itself to be non-religious by inference. The senators and representatives, before mentioned, and the members of the several state legislatures, and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and of several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution, but no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Since the oath or affirmation required by every person taking office within the government was based on their full support of the Constitution was by definition declared to be non-religious in nature. The oath of the affirmation was never intended to be considered a religious test. The silence here regarding a higher power or law is deafening when compared with the earlier appeal made to the truth and rightness of their cause in the Declaration. The silence is also consistent with the other two instances of oath-taking or affirmation given within the Constitution. The first, when the Senate would sit for the purpose of trying an impeachment of the President, and second, in the installation of the President. In the second case, the Constitution even supplied the words of the oath or affirmation that the President-elect would need to make. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will to the best of my ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. In all cases, the oath or affirmation was to be a declaration of good conscience to personal faithfulness and best effort in support and implementation of the Constitution. The laws of nature or nature's God were not being invoked, but instead the appeal was made to individual conscience and the previously ratified Constitution. Another evidence that the Constitution was not a religious statement, nor viewed as such by the Founding Fathers, is found within Article 11 of the Treaty of Tripoli, 1797, which was written 8 years later. As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, and tranquility of Muslims, and as the said states never have entered into any war or acts of hostility against any Mohammedan nation, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries. This statement has been identified as the earliest reference to the United States being founded on Christian religion and substantially denies the claim. According to historical record, this treaty was read publicly on the Senate floor, unanimously approved, and signed into law by one of the Founding Fathers, then President John Adams. Although the Constitution was never intended to be a religious test in and of itself, if there is an absence of faith in something higher among the constituents, then the Constitution, and thereby the will of the people, effectively becomes the highest power in society. The founders purposefully created a nation that based its legitimacy on popular will, not on some higher power. Perhaps it should not surprise us to realize that if we use deistic constructs and arguments, inevitably we will be brought back to a deistic conclusion. Reason is paramount in determining religious truth. Due to humanity's inherent need to put faith in something, this has led some to the belief that democratic decisions are the proper means for discerning what the divine will is, both for nation and society. With this conclusion and covert religiosity in mind, some have even suggested that belief that the United States is a Christian nation is a form of idolatry. The desire to separate church and state was not intended to be a value judgment of one over the other, but instead intended as a construct for better understanding how the two should coexist and mutually support each other. At its core, the U.S. Constitution is an amazing historical document. Its purpose was to counter Constantinianism at the legislative level, and there has never been anything like it in the preceding 1,500 years. The strength of the Constitution's wording has been shown to be true in later years in its use to empower minorities, a great example of the power of the written word. That being said, Although the Constitution irrevocably condemns the tyranny of the British Parliament, in reality the British Empire freed their slaves a full generation before the United States did, and accomplished it without a war. Let's turn our attention now to the Bill of Rights, especially the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. This amendment established the exercise of religion as an inalienable right for all citizens, while also seeking to prevent the state from pressing religious exercise onto the citizenry. Among the founding fathers, some like Jefferson and Madison advocated more strongly for complete separation, while others like Adams and Washington believed that religion was essential to the cultivation of a virtuous citizenry, an essential trait of any successful republic. Let's consider some scholarly reflections on these documents. Burton L. Mack suggests that what was thought to be a constitutional guarantee of religious freedom from the state was originally a policy formulated in the interest of freedom of the state from control by religion. Although such separation was not at first appreciated by the majority of colonies, Green reports that in a short span of 16 years, 1775 to 1791, the nation was transformed from maintaining religious establishments in 9 of the 13 colonies to achieving disestablishment at the national level, and in 10 new states, or 11 depending on how one views Vermont. This is interesting. At the time of the Constitution, at the time of the Bill of Rights, the states were actually still supporting Christian activities through governmental funds. Mack also has written, many people saw the separation of church and state as a concession necessary for the unity of the newly formed nation, because intolerance already was a problem among several colonies. In review, let's consider the truthfulness of the statement, the United States of America was founded as a Christian nation. Although all 13 of the American colonies shared a common heritage in the British Empire, the circumstances of their foundings differed greatly. The New England colonies were infused with an ethos of looking for religious freedom and the possibility of creating a new Christian society, while at the same time looking for a better economic situation. The middle and southern colonies were centered more strongly on the economic and imperial expansionist goals, with only just a few instances of specifically religious motives. Despite these differences, the union of these 13 colonies in 1776 was primarily based on political, economic, and ideological concerns, and not religious ones. Again, it is important to repeat, the union of these 13 colonies in 1776 was primarily based on political, economic, and ideological concerns, and not religious ones. Although important to many of the individual constituents, religious freedom was not the primary concern that brought the colonies together. The fact that almost all of the colonists shared in a Protestant heritage may have helped facilitate their unity, but this historical commonality was never made the basis for their union. In fact, considering the plurality of the colonies and their very different experiences of Christian nations in their lands of origin, the creation of a national church was never even a serious suggestion. Such rhetoric would have become a flashpoint for great strife and disagreement among the 12% active church attenders, not to mention the majority of the unchurched. When we ask the same questions of the founding documents, we again meet with a noticeable lack of evidence, especially if we focus on the word Christian and all that it might imply. Although the Declaration of Independence does contain some religious language and existential themes, there is nothing that could be truly identified as specifically Christian. The generic nature of the language used is not blatantly offensive to believers, but when one considers the richness of Christian doctrine and the portrayal of the person of the Creator, the images are at best weak, distant, and unaffected. John Owen makes the claim that although Enlightenment ideas are generally understood as non-religious, capable of articulation and thriving without appeal to the Christian God, these are really just secularized ideas that developed in Latin Christendom, particularly its Protestant form. Therefore, the deistic language proved tenable enough that any professing Christians present consented to the founding documents. The terminology by no means emphasized the establishment of a particularly Christian nation. As for the testimony of the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, not a single direct comment is made about any particular tenet of Christian faith. Interestingly, the Treaty of Tripoli in 1797, ratified 8 years after the Constitution, very specifically says the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. The case could not have been any more clearly stated. Returning to my earlier stated thesis, the history and context of the founding of the United States is better described as the founding of a nation free to be Christian. From a cultural and demographic standpoint, the peoples of the United States would have been considered Christian, if only by virtue of their European and British origins. Green's conclusion seems reasonable. The majority of the founders also believed that religion was necessary for maintaining moral virtue, and assumed that the nation would remain culturally Christian. The wall of separation between church and state was an ideological one maintained by the founding documents, but the Bill of Rights affirmed the conviction that all citizens should be free to exercise their religion. Although it might be hard to imagine that the founding fathers were thinking of religion as something outside the Judeo-Christian tradition, at the same time, based on what we know of their philosophical and religious positions, it would be safe to assume that a number of them would not have had a problem with a broader interpretation. Probably the greatest importance to this discussion is the observation that the United States of America was established in direct opposition to the normative Constantinian assumptions that had stood behind the relationship between church and state for almost 1,500 years. The ethos of the documents testify to a government supporting liberty and human rights. At the same time, the spirit of Constantinianism was far from absent in America. Although the terminology of Constantinianism makes it sound like Constantine was to blame, for our benefit it would be better to understand this tendency as the temptation facing Christians to make peace with the world through accommodation and compromise. For Constantine's part, we can only commend his insight. The cohesion of the Roman Empire was weakening, and this amazing, tenacious new religion called Christianity seemed to provide the solution he was looking for. As we discussed in the first session, the 3rd century church was facing mounting pressure towards laxity in church discipline and conformity to their surrounding culture. Eventually, being a Christian would no longer be something radical in this world, but instead just the predictable following of cultural norms. We're now going to look at some findings of, again, Fink and Stark, but this isn't a study done almost 20 years later, looking at a statistical survey of Christianity in American society. Note that in this additional research, Fink and Stark have upped their estimate from 12% to 17%, but this adjustment is mostly taking into consideration the inclusion of children, which became common practice in the citing of church membership. On the eve of the Revolution, only about 17% of Americans were churched. By the start of the Civil War, the proportion had risen dramatically to 37%. The immense dislocations of the war caused a serious decline in adherence in the South, which is reflected in the overall decline to 35% in the 1870 census. The rate then began to rise once more, and by 1906, slightly more than half of the U.S. population was churched. Adherence rates reached 56% by 1926. Since then, the rate has been rather stable, although inching upwards. By 1980, church adherence was about 62%. Graphically, it looks like this. As one looks at this amazing progression of religious adherence in America, part of the explanation lays in the phenomena of revivalist religion and the corresponding growth of evangelicalism. Revivalist religion was based on the conviction that every individual had both the right, capacity, and freedom to choose for themselves. This underlying conviction of self-determination and independence resonated with the ethos of the American Revolution, and so the success of the American fight for political liberty from Britain brought with it both conviction and desire to exercise all of one's freedoms, including that of religious affiliation. Thomas Kidd makes these observations. Religion did not cause the American Revolution, yet religion was omnipresent in the Revolution. Religious concepts and biblical rhetoric framed colonist understanding of what was happening in the Revolution. No matter what a person's religious background was, for most Americans, the fight for independence was a religious experience involving both hope and faith. And then Kidd says, like Paine, Thomas Jefferson did not let his own skepticism about Christian doctrine preclude the use of a theistic argument to persuade Americans. And it was exactly such rhetoric that caused both common and elite Americans to make countless connections between religion and the Revolution. Thomas Kidd also observed, the American Continental Congress during the war was ostensibly secular, but it sometimes issued proclamations for prayer, fasting, and thanksgiving that employed detailed theological language. In this way, the deism of many of the founding fathers was actually a blessing, because when the impossible happened and America won its independence from the most powerful political force on earth, the idea of God was reinforced in the nation's psyche, without finishing the sentence detailing what true Christianity should be. Independence had been ushered in by prophetic voices, and many Americans would now be looking for vision and answers about how to connect with this amazing God who had liberated them and brought them into their land of promise. And this is exactly where revivalist religion resonated. Mark Noll made this observation: the theology of leading revivalists in the 19th century suggested that God had bestowed on all people the ability to come to Christ. Noll also went on to say, one of the practices that the American passion for liberty most affected was Bible reading. Revivalism placed responsibility on the individual and expected that their Christian life would proceed from their own personal conviction and commitment. In his implementation of revivalism, Charles Finney used the anxious bench, which led to the modern evangelistic practice of coming to the front at the end of a religious service to indicate a desire for salvation. James McGready, Barton Stone, and others popularized camp meetings where thousands of people were converted and testified to a personal experience of God's Spirit. With the Methodists using circuit riders and the Baptists using preacher farmers, hundreds of new congregations were established and maintained, thus creating a new model of evangelism and discipleship that would become the norm for the expanding frontier. This call to individual action did not only affect evangelism and mission, but the great profusion of voluntary societies that sprang up in America in the first third of the 19th century can be traced directly to revival energies. Fundamentally, if there is something to be learned from the American story, it is the way that both religion and politics touch the human spirit, and the attempt to fully separate the two spheres is practically impossible. As Max stated, the story of America as a Christian nation is one of myth-making by degrees. In other words, when a people consider their own history with a religious imagination, the story is bound to take on new meanings and perspectives. Let's consider for a moment the meaning of this word myth. Myth is a noun from the Greek mythos, a usually traditional story of ostensibly historical events that serves to unfold part of the worldview of a people or explain a practice, belief, or natural phenomena. A popular belief or tradition that has grown up around something or someone, especially when embodying the ideals and institutions of a society or segment of society. This now leads us to the conclusion of this presentation. Although the United States was founded on amazing documents that consciously subverted any Constantinian impulse, the numerical growth of Christianity in the 19th century awakened the same desires and a political agenda that manifested itself in the Roman Empire of the 4th century. What had begun as a declaration of true religious freedom and choice was now coming under great societal pressure to be rewritten as a specifically Christian narrative. The Christianization of the American people deeply affected the self-image of the nation and helped to produce a very specific American civil religion. Andrew Manis has said, American civil religion is the system of mythic meanings embedded and diffused throughout their culture by which Americans interpret the ultimate meaning of their nation. The promotion of nationalism can even be shown to be like a religion, with sacred texts like the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, etc., a calendar with memorial holidays, rituals, pledge of allegiance, anthems, and recognized prophets and prophetic voices. Throughout American history, the church has used political means and the politicians have used religious means in ways that endangered and compromised the proper functioning of either system. In this way, civil religion could also be understood as religious nationalism. And there's a great temptation to mix these spheres. We see in the American context the sacralization of politics. Jefferson and Franklin wanted to incorporate scenes from the Exodus on the national seal. Lincoln rhetorically suggested that God was involved in the conflict between the North and South. And "In God We Trust" replaced "E pluribus unum" out of many one in 1956 on American bills and coins. We also see the politicization of the sacred. Laws reflecting religious convictions, like prohibition, mandatory prayer in public sphere, etc. The American version of Constantinianism has produced its own body of myths that, when taken at face value, have become the antithesis of true Christian principles. Rather than demonstrations of justice, affirmation of intrinsic value, compassion, and mercy, they've become rationalizations for injustice, discrimination, hate, and even violence. For example, some of the myths that belong to the American story: manifest destiny, justification for American imperialism, and confiscation of native lands, imagining the American colonists as a new Israel, escaping slavery and claiming the promised land. The curse of Ham. This was used in the South as a justification for black slavery. Redeemer nation. Divine support for the wielding of political and military power to protect and free other nations from false ideologies. These observations are not meant to say that what a government should or should not do. Scripture makes it clear that judging those outside the church is not our mandate. At the same time, any form of mandated Christianity is bound to fail in fulfilling God's purpose. The true call to discipleship to Jesus is one that respects the free will of every person and their God-given right to choose. No legal system or form of government can bring about the transformation that Jesus intended except the law of freedom and the law of grace, the good news about Jesus Christ. The only power to change humanity according to God's will is the gospel. The last 4 years, the Trump administration has popularized the mantra, "Make America Great Again." What is most curious about this statement is the actual time of greatness is never clearly stated or identified. When was America truly great? I'm not sure there really is a correct answer. At the same time, I personally cannot imagine a better conceived national constitution than the one possessed by the United States of America. When properly applied, it has promoted and guaranteed freedom and human rights, and from the beginning has stood in clear opposition to a legislated Constantinianism. Maybe it's time for America to return to this founding definition of freedom, of which the Declaration speaks. Granted, this is not the same freedom of which the gospel speaks, that is, the freedom from sin and guilt, and the freedom from the fear of death. But the freedom described in the Declaration does resonate with the theme of Paul's prayer for earthly authorities as found in 1 Timothy 2, 1-4. I urge then, first of all, that requests, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for everyone, for kings and for all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. This is good and pleases God our Savior, who wants all men to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. God never intended for human government or society to do our Christian ministry for us. Instead, as disciples of Jesus, we should pray for the freedom and live lives that imitate Christ's love, service, and compassion for others. And finally, some concluding thoughts from Brian Stone. The Constantinian story is really the proclamation that a nation or culture is Christian, and thus eliminating the distinction between the world and the church. The only cure for a Constantinian church is the church's visible obedience and faithful witness on the one hand, and a respect for the integrity of the world's disbelief on the other. In other words, rejection of the world to the gospel is not necessarily failure. In fact, it may actually be a sign of success. Modernity is the story of a world that believes itself to have come of age, and society is now to be construed as a contract between individuals whose freedom or right to pursue their own private ends and maximize their own self-interest is restricted only by the freedom or right of other individuals to do the same. Such self-interest comes at direct odds to the purposes of God in the formation of the church, and the church can be tempted to accommodate and center evangelism on offering services and help in ways that society markets and demands. Instead, the church is called to reach out to the world as a response to and participation in the salvation it has been given. The Constantinian temptation is real. Rather than depend on the gospel and the power of a righteous life, the shortcut is to use political means and power. If history has shown us anything, this type of solution may have some short-term benefits, but in the end leads to corruption and systemic injustice. In conclusion, let's just consider where true power lies. As Paul said in Romans 1, verse 16, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew and then for the Gentile. And then as Jesus told us, our lives have power. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another.